Okay, we going to conclude the introductory section today, and it's possible we might even get into animism a little bit. So let's see. Now, this next portion may seem a little bit technical and complicated. It has to be by nature just because there are so many ways that people try to describe the relationship between religions and other disciplines. Okay, if that makes sense. So psychology, society, environment, history, culture, all of them interact somehow with world religions. And so the question is, how? And we're not going to answer that exhaustively. There's no way we can. Each one of these could be an entire semester of study. In fact, I teach cultural anthropology, which spends an entire semester on this one here. You guys study Intro to Psych and Counseling, which is relates to that one, and so on. So let's start with psychology. Now tell me, what is psychology technically? What's the word mean?
Study of the soul.
Yeah, study of the soul. To put it in simpler terms, to study man's immaterial part, how he thinks, that sort of thing. So there was a time when psychology was considered taboo in the study of religion because of the impact of modern psychology and its godless approach to existence. But the fact of the matter is, when we talk about psychology, we're simply talking about the way man thinks. And the Bible has a lot to say about that. So some questions we ask: do we consider psychology enough in our study of religion? Well, when we study religions, is it important to ask the question, what makes man tick? Why does he think the way he does? And the answer is yes. How do we decide, how do we learn about the way man thinks? How do we learn about the way that man thinks? Well, we have a source. The Scriptures. The Scriptures tell us why man thinks the way he does. Paul talks about those who are after the flesh, have the mindset of the flesh, those who are of the Spirit have the mindset of the Spirit, and so on, right? But do people think the same way in every culture? No, absolutely not. Man has the same fallen condition. There are certain things about his mindset that are true no matter where he lives, but there are cultural inputs and influences that cause people to think in different ways in different places. And so it is important to understand that, because the Bible is a worldview. You could even say that the Bible is a mindset. The Bible presents a way of thinking. Yeah?
Do we address secular psychology as well, or do we only consider biblical?
It depends. Yes, you do. If you're in a culture, for instance, where a particular type of psychology, a particular school of psychology dominates, like atheism or something like that, then it is important to have at least a cursory understanding of how people in that culture think. I think Paul did that when he traveled from place to place. Every place was different, and the way that he presented his message corresponded to some of the biases and the mindset of the people who lived in those places. Yep, you don't have to be an expert on them. What we should be an expert on is the truth of God's Word. But that doesn't mean that we close our eyes to, some of those things that influence people in society. The discipline of psychological anthropology. There are lots of different kinds of anthropology. Psychological anthropology just basically deals with the question of, what makes man think. And we're not going to get into that today, but it is a discipline that's out there, and it deals with the way people think. The interaction of psychology and culture. How does that work? Some of you have lived in other countries, and you've seen the effects of the way people think in other cultural settings, okay? And so that's something you have to consider. The role of personality. One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about sharing the gospel and talking about Christianity is that personality does play a big role. Sometimes we get the idea that, there's culture X, culture Y, and culture Z, and we expect people in each of those cultural settings to act and think a certain way. And sometimes we're surprised when they don't. And that's because even within fairly well-established cultures, there are differences in personalities that cause people. For instance, Brazil, by and large, is a country where people are very open and they're happy and they like to talk, they like to be loud, okay? And yet, I've met some very shy, quiet Brazilian people. If I go to Brazil for a week or two as a visitor and I meet people who are from a very, quiet, reserved family background, I may come back home telling people that Brazilians are very quiet, shy people. See, so personality is important. Remember that we're always dealing with individuals. Did you read the example of the unkempt man in your reading? Do you remember reading about that? The guy that had his hair was all disheveled. There was a picture of him in the book. Do you remember coming across that in the reading? Okay. What page did you read through for this time? Okay. Yeah. I was thinking you came to him already in the reading, but you didn't. Well, a picture of a man, you'll come across it, who looks kind of like what you would call a homeless guy here. His hair is a mess. He's wearing very simple, torn clothing. You think, oh, the poor guy. But in reality, it's a picture of a Hindu, an aged Hindu man who has actually taken a vow. He's stepped into a stage of life where he has become kind of a sage. And people who look at him, people who are Hindu in their belief system, look at him with great respect and great honor. And so the way that they see him is very, very different than the way you and I would see him coming from the outside world. And so when we approach people of other religious persuasions, other religious systems, it's important that we don't misinterpret the things that we observe about them. Going back to phenomenology again, that idea of drawing conclusions based on observation. See, we can be very, very, very misled in our conclusions about people because we expect people who believe a certain way to dress a certain way. So does that make sense? Just be careful that we don't misinterpret them. All right, some searching questions. Are certain psychological or emotional states necessary to make religion valid? Well, do we believe that emotion is a big part of our belief system, of Christianity? Does emotion play a big role in Christianity? Well, absolutely. Just you don't have to go very far in the scripture to find that we're to rejoice, we're to be glad, okay? Now, we would say that emotions should not be driven, we would say that our emotions should be driven by the intellect and not vice versa. Okay, but there are some religious systems in the world where it appears, at least on the surface, that the emotions are driving the religion itself. Okay, if you're in a place where Pentecostalism is dominant, for example, it may appear that it's nothing more than just a bunch of emotion. Okay, so there is the question in every religious system. Can you think of an example of a religious system that apparently appears to show very little emotion? Maybe some of your Baptist churches. Yes.
Would it be like Islam, Buddhism, or not at all?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. Compared to others, yeah, they would maybe not place the same emphasis on emotional expression. Yeah. And again, even within those systems, it differs some. Must adherents approach their gods with emotion? How do you approach God? You've all seen people approach God almost rather flippantly, and you might even tend to judge them as saying, you're being disrespectful before God. And yet in their system, in their culture, they don't consider that disrespectful. They consider that fellowship, intimacy with their God. The more intimate you are with your God, the more you can be yourself, the more you can be extrovertish in your relationship to him. See, so all these things, I'm just giving you some basic things to consider when you're observing other religions. What's the relationship between intention and right practice? Every religious system comes with some sort of intention to accomplish something. But there are some religious systems that will actually say that, you can go against the moral grain in order to please the God that you're serving. And so, it impacts some. How does our perception of the human struggle impact our psychological state? How do people react to the human struggle? I mean, when you observe people who are struggling with illness or injustice or whatever, what's your reaction? How do you react inside? What you believe, your belief system, will impact the way you respond to what you see going on around you. See? So if I were to ask you, as a Christian, with a Christian worldview, how should you respond to struggle that you see going on in the world around you? What should characterize your response to that as a Christian? Yeah. Okay. Prayer and compassion. All right. Now, if you were a Taoist, okay, or Confucianist, but we'll talk about Taoism later, and I were to ask you that same question, you would answer me very differently. You would say, oh, no, don't mess with the struggle, because the yin-yang balance must not be upset. And the problem with man is he tries to fix what he perceives as being wrong, and he fails to understand that which he sees as wrong is actually a necessary part of the delicate balance that we must seek to maintain. And how do you maintain that balance in Taoism? By living and let live. Don't try to change it. Don't try to fix it. We need both. See, so even the way you perceive struggle and how that should be dealt with is going to vary differently from religion to religion. Okay? What about the issue of society? Every society is composed of what we call social domains. Any guess as to what a social domain might be? Give you a hint. We're in one right now. What's the social domain we're in right now? Yeah, I was thinking we're in an educational domain, classroom domain, right? A learning domain. So let me give you a bunch of them here. These are 8 principal social domains that impact the way people believe and live. And notice that religion is one of them, but it's not the only one. It interacts with other ones. Mm-hmm. And they all intersect. They all interact together. Yeah. Give me an example where a person's country highly impacts his or her religion. Where those two domains are very tight.
Being an Israel is a lot different than being in America for pressures. When if you're born Jewish, there's going to be a little more pressure to be.
Okay. Now, when we get to Judaism, we'll talk about the difference between being a Jew biologically and being a Jew religiously, because they do maintain. There are many people who are very strongly Jewish, but they're not at all religious. But yeah, well, that's right. You're go to Saudi Arabia, okay? You can hardly see a distinction between the country and the religion, because they operate as a state religion there. But in America, we champion individualism, see? And we actually go almost to the opposite extreme. So all of these domains, and you're part, some of you are part of all these. You play sports, you're in them. You have friends, neighbors, okay. These domains can be analyzed as traditional and modern domains. So let me give you a comparison. Traditional societies, now when I say traditional, understand I'm talking about, this is probably a generalization, and I know it is. Rural America tends to be more traditional, for example, than urban America. Does that make sense? How many of you are from rural America? All right. things change more slowly in those places than they do in urban centers and so on. So we're using the idea of traditional societies to refer to societies where older traditional mores, norms are still held on to, whereas modern societies, not so much. So there are fewer social domains. For example, in some very small rural areas, the barber may also be your pastor because he's working a second job because he has a very small church, okay? And he also may be on the city council, and something else in town. So there are fewer social domains, and people assume more responsibilities. There are tightly knit, there are also more tightly knit domains. Those of you who live in more rural areas, I would guess, unless there are some exceptions, you tend to be more tight in your relationships with people. Part of that's just of necessity. When you don't have as many people to lean on, and as many options, you tend to knit together, all right? They're multi-stranded relationships. As I said, your barber may be your pastor, may be a city councilman, may be, on the volunteer fire department, all of those, right? There's resistance to change in those kinds of communities. It's harder to affect change because those traditions are very embedded. And then there is sociocentric mindset. What in the world is that? What does sociocentric mean? Yeah, it's more community focused, exactly. And in cultural anthropology, we spend quite a bit of time talking about individualism versus collectivism, but that's part of that idea. Now, does this affect religious systems? Absolutely. Absolutely. There are Catholic countries, for example, that are very, very strongly traditional. Can you give me an example of a Catholic country that you would consider fairly traditional, fairly tight in its society? Philippines, interesting, yeah. You have, in your background is Filipino, yeah. Strong Catholic Church there, pretty traditional, yeah. Is Catholicism big in the United States? Sure, there are lots of Catholics here. Are they traditional as a general rule? No, very much, very, very different. Very much reflecting more of a modern society. So even within major religions, there are huge differences in the way that the people within the same religion live and think because of the influence of the kinds of societies that they're in. It's just important to keep that in mind. Evangelicalism has become really powerful in Latin America, made great inroads, and it has affected the way that even Catholics think. So that's something important to keep in mind. We'll see that when we study different kinds of Buddhism, different kinds of Hinduism. A lot of the reasons for those differences is because of the kinds of communities that they live in. It does make a difference. Some of you maybe go to churches, even looking at Christianity, where it's still piano and organ, suit and tie for the men, dress for the women, and anything else is liberal. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that there are communities that still do that. Others, the last time the pastor wore a tie was probably, when he got his 5th grade picture taken or something. It's just it's not, and it's not that one's right and one's wrong. It's the influence of society, local influence. So in modern societies, rather than few social domains, there are multiple social domains because it's a more complex system. So you've got a lot more things going on in society. Loosely knit domains. Why are they more loosely knit? Because if I don't want to be on the city council, no problem. There's plenty of people that can do this. If I don't, if I don't want to be the coach of the soccer team, there are 15 other dads that'll be willing to do that. So the more complex the society, the looser and that spills over into religion. Okay, the more loose the society is, the more likely it is for people not to be as tightly connected to their religious system. There are lots of other options out there. They see other people living other ways, and so there's more of a tendency. So if God leads you to serve, in a Buddhist place, for example, that's a little more liberal, or open, then you might find that to be true. Okay? Single-stranded relationships. In other words, the barber is a full-time barber. The pastor is a full-time pastor. These guys aren't handling it. They're not doing as much multitasking, if I can use that terminology. And there is a tendency to change. In fact, change is viewed as progress. In a traditional society, change can be viewed as what? If you're a really tight, close-knit society, what can change be viewed as? Instability. It can become a threat, right? And so religious systems in those kinds of communities tend to also maintain their traditional, heels dug in belief system. Whereas over here, if there's not change, what's the matter with us? Why aren't we moving forward? See? And that spills over into religions as well. So you end up with all kinds of splinter groups from Buddhism or Hinduism or even Islam and Christianity. And part of the reason for all those splinter groups is because society in general. So you see the influence that one has on the other. And then instead of a sociocentric mindset, there is more of an egocentric mindset. It's about me. I'm my own entity, rather than thinking about the good of the community. Does Christianity tend to lend itself more to a sociocentric or egocentric approach to life? That's good. I purposely made that an open-ended question, and your answer is good. Go ahead, develop your answer.
Well, the way American culture thinks is probably more than modern, but the way it probably should be more run is a mix of the traditional and
And that mix is really, really hard to get, isn't it? We like to call that balance, right? We want to be balanced. We want to have traditional. I mean, just look at the way we sing. My son's a music pastor in Michigan, and he works really hard to maintain a balance between singing traditional hymns and also singing new songs that are being written that are good. We try to do that here at Faith. Go to chapel, you notice sometimes there's songs from Fanny Crosby days, and other times it's today we sang an Isaac Newton song, right? And then we sang. My Heart is Filled with Thankfulness, a fairly new song. I mean, it may not sound new to you, but, on a larger scale, it's very new. So, yeah, that's a very good question. And we're going to talk about, in almost all these religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, you have a version that's very tight and traditional. In Hinduism, we'll see those who only follow the Vedas, the old scriptures. But then you find that the majority of Hindus today, did I say Buddhists? I meant Hindus. The majority of Hindus today actually adopt more of the Upanishads, the additions that have been made to the old Vedas. We'll get into that later. I'm just saying that part of what pushes that is modern societal pressure to expand, to move forward, to diversify. Okay? All right. And of course, we have to ask the question as Christians, okay, to what extent can we give in to this? What limits do the Bible give to us? That's a big discussion in Christianity. How do I know when the Bible is giving me permission to move beyond the traditional in a particular area, whether it's music and worship, or whether it's, when we meet for church, even things like churches not having an evening service anymore. I remember when I first started hearing about that, I thought, okay, here we go. Churches are just going to forget it, altogether. Well, it hasn't happened, and so at least, by and large. So these are all factors that you have to take in. So wherever God leads you to serve, this is the type of question you should be asking when you walk into that culture. What is the makeup, the composition of this culture, and how does that influence the way that they think about spiritual matters? Questions or comments about this that you have? I know that each one of these there's just so much packed into this, and we're kind of summarizing here. Is that a question or just, oh, okay. All right, culture. So give me a definition of culture. Who in here has taken cultural anthropology? You have, and you have, and you have. You three, and did you take it with me? Yeah, okay, 4 of you. So you can't answer this. Give me a definition of culture. What is culture? There's really not a wrong answer. It's a very broad subject. Throw something at me.
A way of life.
A way of life is probably the safest and most complete way of saying it. A way of life. Somebody else?
In management class, we're talking about organizational culture, and culture is the way that defines how an organization works.
Okay. Yeah. So even within the world of the professional world, there is a culture, professional culture. Interesting. Do you guys remember what Geir Hofstede said when I gave a list in culture anthropology? He said culture is the software of the mind. You remember that statement? That was pretty interesting. So let me give you, here, your book says the sum total ways of living developed by a group of human beings and handed on from generation to generation. Again, it's one of many possible, do you already have these in your notes? Okay, I forgot about that. Culture refers to the beliefs, values, motives, attitudes, cosmologies, knowledge, practices, and meanings shared by a larger group of people. So here, he's trying to give you a very general definition. Here, he's trying to be a lot more specific, okay? This is also in your notes. Lloyd Quast presented this view, and in culture anthropology, you'll remember we went through this as well, right? So let's see, and you culture anthropology experts can help us fill these in. Culture is both material and immaterial. These elements together reflect a worldview. So what is on the surface? Do you happen to remember what that is? On the crust of the earth there, what would be the outermost part of culture? It is behavior. It's what we watch people do, what we observe. We talk about phenomenology. This is the phenomenology at its most basic level. You walk into a Hindu culture and you notice right away people are dressed a certain way. They act a certain way. They even walk a certain way. Sometimes the man's walking in front and the women and children are walking behind him. Why is that? Is there a reason for that? Okay, and you observe all these things, okay? But that's not enough to figure the culture out. You also have to go to the second level. Anybody remember that one? I'm going to go back and change all your grades. No, I'm just kidding. I don't. Values. Why do people dress the way they do? Why do they eat the kinds of food they do? Why do they go to the places they go to? All that has to do with what they value. What is considered good or best in a culture? Right? In a very materialistic culture like ours, to many people, even wearing brand name clothing is important. I have a son that was wild about shoes for a while. He's kind of gotten over that now, but he was really into shoes. He even thought about maybe going into the business of designing shoes, but he's beyond that now. But anyway, having said that, there's nothing like Hey Dudes, guys. Get your Hey Dudes, man. They're like slippers. I love them. Beliefs. Why do people value what they value? Because they believe that something is true about something or something's false. And so that influences their values. And then at the very core, the part that you don't see or will never see tangibly is what? What's the big buzzword we put in the middle? It is your worldview. So when you think of worldview, just take all these things with it. Your worldview is based on your belief system, which determines what you value and ultimately how you express yourself in life. I thought that was a pretty good, and the problem is when your parents were where? In Zambia. So did you know the Petersons there? Okay, you know Sam and Jordan Peterson? They were in Zambia when they were kids. Okay. I don't remember what agency they were with. So, did you grow up there?
I was there for 4 years.
4 years. Okay. So you could probably give us illustrations of certain customs there that are specifically related to religious belief system. What is Spiritism kind of a dominant religious system there, or what would you in Zambia?
It was primarily Christian actually.
Oh, really?
They were just very undeveloped. I went to Togo this summer, but that is primarily like Hinduism.
Okay, a lot of, yeah. And Africa in general, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is extremely animistic, which is what we'll talk about next. But okay, so you go to visit a country and you have to start asking questions. Why are they doing this, and so on. All right. Now, which one drives which one? Does culture drive religion, or does religion drive culture? Okay. Now, what do you think? How would you answer that? What do you say, Isaac? You're shaking your head back there.
I think they both kind of drive each other. They're two fused together in a lot of cases.
Okay. Now, if you have to go all the way back to origins, and you ask, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? In this case, when push comes to shove, what came first? That's a tough question to answer because man was created in the same week that God created everything else, right? Okay. But man was created a spiritual being. So, I would tend to say, I'm using the word religion here in the broad sense, okay, to refer to spiritual issues. I would tend to say that the way man is spiritually is going to determine the way, what happened when man rebelled against God spiritually? His culture was completely upset by it, right? The culture did not determine his spirituality. His spirituality is what caused his culture to be what it was. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, they are not easily disentangled, okay? And by the way, that's a good reminder to us that God intended for the life we live here, the day-by-day life, to be integrated with what we believe. God never intended for there to be a dichotomy between the two, And our country makes a big deal that our country does not want to see those mixed. You cannot have God in the public schools. You cannot, and it's really a misunderstanding of God's intention at the creation that man as a spiritual being be intertwined into the culture in which he's living. And in some religious systems, that's much more obvious. History, okay? What about history? How many of you like studying history? Okay, a couple of brave souls. Understanding the history of a religion gives us insight into the unique contribution that the religion made at the time of its birth, as well as how it was sustained through time. If you try to study a religion, any one of the ones that we study, without knowing the historical background, influences, what got it started, when we get into Hinduism, that's going to become really complex because people groups are migrating to what is today India. And that migration had a huge impact on the belief system that represents that country today. It's just, if you don't know the history of Islam, what happened with Muhammad, and the wars and his flight from his home and his return, if you don't understand that history, forget trying to understand anything about Islam. Christianity, very, very much. 70% of the Word of God is narrative, history. Christianity is a movement of translation because the fundamental concepts of the faith find their final destination in local cultural idioms. By translation, we mean that Christianity was intended to be spread. Of the religions that we study, only 3 of them are actually considered missionary religions. Can you guess which ones they are? Christianity obviously is one of them. What would be the other 2 major religions that consider themselves missionary religions? Yeah? Pardon? Buddhism, yeah, to some degree would be considered a missionary religion. Hinduism is not. They're not interested in winning people. But there is at least a sect of Buddhism that seeks to make converts. That's the question you're asking there. How do you know if a religion is a missionary religion? Does it seek converts? If it's not trying to spread and win converts, it's not a missionary religion. Okay? Christianity and Islam would be the 2 strongest ones. Islam is trying every way possible to spread. Even by biological reproduction in countries having big families and so on. Okay, finally, environment. Okay, notice I put it in green to be a good environmentalist. The impact of environment. Well, animism is the most obvious of all. I think we won't get into that today. We'll wait and start that on Thursday, which we're right on schedule. Animism, more than any other religion that we study, makes a big deal of the environment, which we would call the creation, okay? Spiritual forces fill the natural world. You know, they possess plants and objects and so on. Natural laws impact religious beliefs. What are natural laws? What's that? Gravity, somebody say? Yeah. Laws that pertain to the material world that we live in, natural laws. They impact religious beliefs. We believe that gravity functions because God created the world that way. But not every belief system necessarily believes it. In fact, there are some belief systems that believe that everything we see is actually an illusion. We're not really seeing it. We're not actually meeting here. We're not actually having this conversation. It's all an illusion. Totally different approach to reality as we see it. The environment. 3, general revelation. That's what we call it. God speaks through nature. We don't despise the general revelation. We believe that it's a very, very important part of God's expression of himself to us. But there are some religions that believe that it's more than that. The trees and plants are not God's expression of himself to us. They are actually God's. They are spirit-filled. They actually have powers, supernatural powers, okay? And then rituals. They often make use of natural elements in their rituals. And again, a lot of this, you see animism coming through in a lot of this because it is the one that is most influenced by the environment, more than any of the others by far, animism. All right? And the last slide I have for you is this. And this, I want to conclude with this because it is very, very important. Anybody want to take a stab at what emic or etic mean? We did mention this in cultural anthropology just briefly, but any idea what that's talking about? Who has the best chance of understanding Hinduism? Someone that lives in India or someone who lives in the United States? Now be careful with your answer. It's a trick question. The answer, the knee-jerk answer of all of us is somebody lives in India. I mean, it's their country, it's their religion, right? That's what we call an emic perspective. It comes from the Greek word en, if you go studying Greek, en, in. An emic interpretation of culture is the interpretation of culture by those who actually live within it. They're part of it. Is there a downside to that? What is it? Yeah. It's in some ways more difficult for somebody on the inside to be totally objective in their understanding of their own religion than it would be from somebody coming from the outside. Not totally, but that is a danger. Yeah.
Would emic that be somebody who is Hindu in India or somebody who is not Hindu in India? Would they still be considered maybe still an outsider because they're not part of the religion?
There are degrees. I mean, these are very basic in general, but yeah, I'm actually referring to it as someone who lives in India, that's the Indian flag, and who is a practicing Hindu, okay, just for purposes of illustration. But you're correct that there would be different degrees on both sides. But just for sake of illustration, let's talk about somebody that's actually a practicing Hindu living in India. That person can tell you an awful lot about his or her belief system, but there are biases that they don't even recognize, okay, that somebody coming from the outside may identify, okay? In fact, you may have even met somebody coming from another country that says something about America or about, American religion that you never thought about before, something they observed. Have you had that happen? Anybody having it? Yeah, I mean, because it's all second nature to us. And sometimes it's only when you're on the outside that you notice things that, you've always taken for granted, never even had to calculate before. Okay, so we are studying all of these religions on which side? The etic perspective. We're looking in. unless some of you have been involved in one of these religions at one time. And we will pick it up with animism next time around. All right, thanks, guys.